Welcome to the deep dive. Today we are taking a stack of sources that deals with just pure creative electricity. We're talking about a film that didn't just meet expectations for a beloved superhero, but it completely shattered the mold. We are swinging headfirst into the story, the science, and the legacy of the 2018 animated masterpiece Spider-Man into the Spider-Verse.
And the materials we've gathered here are just fascinating. We have everything from, confidential production notes and really technical breakdowns from Sony Pictures ImageWorks,
Yeah.
all the way to box office analysis and critical essays.
Yeah.
And they're all united by one overwhelming theme: consensus.
Consensus, that's a great word for it.
It is. So our mission here is to look beyond just, this movie is great.
Right.
We want to synthesize this overwhelming agreement that this film was a foundational aesthetic game changer. We're looking at the mechanics of why critics and even industry insiders called it a revolution, not just another great movie.
Absolutely. And when you have producers like Phil Lord and Christopher Miller involved, style is going to be central. But the execution here went, way above and beyond even their reputation.
For sure.
So I think the central question we really need to unpack is this. How did a film starring a superhero who has been adapted, literally dozens of times in the last 20 years in live action, animation, video games, how did this movie manage to fundamentally redefine what an animated comic book film could look like, feel like, and ultimately achieve?
It's really an examination of creative risk. How that risk, when you marry it with just immense technical precision, can create a true paradigm shift. And I think to understand that, we have to start with the chassis of this revolution, which is the narrative core centered around Miles Morales.
Right.
The sources all agree that just the decision to foreground Miles was essential. It immediately distanced the film from any kind of, cinematic fatigue around Peter Parker.
Okay, so let's really establish those foundational narrative elements. The film kicks off with Miles Morales, and the way the sources describe him is so key. He's deliberately set up as this teenager who is just firmly rooted in Brooklyn.
Yeah, which is a departure in itself from a lot of the other New York depictions.
Right. And most importantly, his background being African-American and Puerto Rican, that's not a side note. It feels central to his identity and his story.
That specificity is what grounds the entire narrative. The producers and writers, they really wanted to use Miles to tell a distinct, modern story about identity and pressure and finding your own voice. So all the chaos of the multiverse that comes later, it's anchored in the reality of his specific, still living family.
And that's a huge point. His family is still there.
Exactly. You have his mother, Rhea Morales, who's a nurse, and his father, Jefferson Davis, a police officer. This family unit is the bedrock of his emotional conflict.
And that family conflict is where all the initial tension lives, even before a radioactive spider ever enters the picture. Miles is a gifted student, but he's really struggling with the expectations of his father, Jefferson.
Yeah.
And our sources highlighted that Jefferson's role as a police officer who openly views the original Spider-Man as a dangerous vigilante, that creates a completely impossible environment for Miles once he starts developing powers.
It's such a sophisticated layer. It's something previous Spider-Man films rarely, if ever, touched on. The hero's identity is intrinsically linked to his family's societal standing and their beliefs. And then you compound that pressure with Miles's relationship with his Uncle Aaron.
A cool uncle.
A rebellious, cooler figure. Yeah, he encourages Miles's artistic side, like his graffiti tagging. So Miles is seeking refuge from his father's expectations with Aaron, but he's tragically unaware that his uncle is secretly moonlighting as the Kingpin's main enforcer, the Prowler.
That dual identity within the family. The hero's most trusted confidant is the villain's second in command. It just raises the personal stakes dramatically.
It really does.
So Miles gets bitten by the radioactive spider. That's the classic origin element. But the real catalyst is just horrific. He later witnesses the Kingpin murder the Spider-Man of his universe, the one voiced by Chris Pine, who's trying to stop this super collider experiment.
And that event, it's not just a sad moment. It forces this mantle onto a teenager who feels completely and totally unprepared.
And that brings us to the mechanism of the chaos itself. Kingpin super collider. The sources are really fascinating in how they describe Wilson Fisk, or Kingpin. We know him traditionally as a mob boss, but here, he's driven by something else.
Something complex, almost sympathetic in a way. His backstory is all about grief.
So what's the core of that drive?
It's purely personal grief, which somehow makes the collateral damage of, shattering reality even more tragic. Kingpin blames the original Spider-Man for the deaths of his wife Vanessa and his son Richard. So the Super Collider isn't just a world-ending device for him. It's a tool for an impossible personal resurrection. His goal is to access parallel universes and just abduct alternate versions of his late family.
Wow, just pull them into his dimension.
Exactly. And that action, the testing of the collider, is what fractures reality and instantly pulls 5 other spider people into Miles's dimension. It's a direct consequence of Kingpin's obsessive grief.
And once Miles is thrust into this impossible situation, he almost immediately encounters his reluctant mentor, Peter B. Parker. This character is so crucial to the film's success because he just flips the traditional heroic mentor trope completely on its head.
He really does. Peter B. Parker's deliberately designed to be the opposite of the heroic, aspirational Peter Parker we've seen before. He's disheveled, he's middle-aged, emotionally exhausted, and just deeply jaded.
And Lord and Miller explicitly said they wanted him to be an amalgamation of all the pop culture Spider-Man adaptations, right?
Yes, a hero just worn down by decades of responsibility. He's navigating a failed marriage with Mary Jane. He's got this existential ennui from being a dimensional outcast. He's a mess.
And the twist on the mentor dynamic is just fantastic. The producer saw him as a Mr. Miyagi who doesn't know anything.
Which creates this beautiful, awkward conflict where the supposed expert doesn't want to teach and the student, Miles, feels utterly unworthy. Peter B. Parker only agrees to help Miles because, well, he literally has no other choice.
And the clock is ticking.
Right. The dramatic necessity ramps up fast. Dr. Octopus, when they're infiltrating Alchemax, she realizes that Peter B. Parker and all the other displaced spider people, they're going to die from cellular decay if they stay in Miles's dimension for too long. So there's a real deadline for Miles to master his powers.
Okay, let's unpack that critical tension the sources observed. This dichotomy between the plot and the concept. Reviewers universally praised the concept. The sheer ambition of multiple dimensions, different Spire people, they called it amazing, fresh, genuinely innovative. But there was this persistent note, especially in some of the video reviews we pulled, that the actual plot, the sequence of events was kind of bland or fairly standard for a superhero movie.
And that's a crucial distinction. If you strip away the visuals and the character diversity, the structure is, in fact, very traditional. Hero gets powers, a villain tries to activate a MacGuffin, the hero needs to stop the MacGuffin before the portal destroys everything.
Oh, why do that? Why stick to such a standard structure when everything else is so revolutionary?
Well, what the sources argue is that the standard plot structure was actually a necessary, almost brilliant choice. The creative team was already overloading the audience with revolutionary visual information, complex character backstories, half a dozen new heroes.
No, it would have been too much.
It might have been. If the plot itself had also been experimental or overly complex, the audience could have been completely overwhelmed. So that traditional chassis provided this essential, reliable anchor point. It let the audience focus their mental energy on absorbing the style and the emotional depth of Miles's journey.
That makes perfect sense. The familiarity of the A to B structure lets the truly innovative parts, the visuals, the characters, it lets them shine without getting lost.
Exactly. And even the sources that found the plot standard, they all praised Miles's character arc. They called the process he goes through to control his unique powers, especially his camouflage and venom blast, really impactful and genuinely well executed at the end.
The emotional beats were strong, but we did find one specific critique about the tone, didn't we?
We did. One source specifically called out a couple of moments that were intended to be very serious, like right after Uncle Aaron's death, where the soundtrack choice, which involved the Lil Wayne song playing while Miles was walking around all mopey, that reviewer felt it was pretty fucking cheesy and it just undercut the intended emotion.
That's a fascinatingly specific critique. A clash between the music supervision and the visual mood.
It's a minor point in the grand scheme, but it highlights the tightrope they were walking, balancing modern teenage angst with classic superhero drama. But overall, the character work was praised for its depth, its humor, and its willingness to raise these mature themes about morality and responsibility.
So the standard structure provided the foundation, but the character work, and especially the style, that was the engine and the custom paint job. And speaking of that paint job, the visual revolution is where the industry really saw this film as a true outlier. Let's shift our focus entirely to how they made this thing look like nothing else.
This is the core of the film's legacy. The aesthetic, the animation style, it's repeatedly cited by critics and industry analysts as the primary reason for the film's success and its influence. We're talking about a genuine paradigm shift in how studios approach blockbuster animation.
The sources use words like revolutionary, game changer, unlike anything else. The 3 directors, Bob Persichetti, Peter Ramsey, and Rodney Rothman, working with Lord and Miller, They had this one goal: make the viewer feel like they had literally walked inside a comic book. But making a 3D environment look deliberately 2D, that sounds like a monumental technical hurdle.
It was more than a hurdle. It was a total overhaul of the pipeline at Sony Pictures Imageworks. The style combined traditional CGI animation, which handles the 3D models and camera, with specific hand-drawn comic techniques like line work, painting, dots. The ultimate goal was anti-photorealism. They wanted every single frame, even if you paused it, to look like a perfectly rendered comic panel. One source called it a living painting.
And that ambition is reflected in the production scope. How big was the team they needed to pull this off, and what were the initial struggles?
The scope was just unprecedented for Sony. It required the largest crew of animators they had ever used for a feature film. I think it peaked at 177 animators.
Wow.
But that number doesn't even tell the whole story. The sources revealed that it took about a year for just 2 key animators to create a mere 10 seconds of finalized approved footage that actually matched the intended look.
A year for 10 seconds. That ratio is just staggering. It really emphasizes the complexity involved in translating static graphic comic language into fluid motion.
Exactly. The difficulty was in managing all that visual noise and blending dimensions. In traditional CGI, you render a smooth surface. Here, they had to program the software to deliberately render imperfections. 2D ink lines had to be applied after the 3D model was animated, but they needed to look like they were always part of it. Then they had to manually apply things like bende dots and halftones, deciding where specific textures would appear. They were essentially fighting against the smoothness that modern CGI always strives for.
Let's get deeper into those specific comic book visual languages they adapted. We know they used classic techniques like visible text.
Oh yeah. Dialogue and Miles's thoughts literally pop up and follow the characters, just like speech and thought bubbles. And you get these massive, stylized onomatopoeia words like POW or BAM appearing right on the image to represent sounds in motion.
Like the old 60s Batman show.
Very much like that. The sound isn't just heard, it's incorporated into the visual narrative itself.
And what about the color and texture, the specific printing effects?
They systematically adopted and adapted these almost archaic comic book printing techniques. To create color and gradients, they used halftones and bende dots. For anyone unfamiliar, bende dots are those tiny colored circles you see in old comics, used to cheaply create the illusion of complex colors or shadows. They digitally rendered these patterns onto every surface. And for shadows and texture, they used crisscross lines, cross-hatching to add depth and simulate that classic pen and ink look.
And one of the coolest technical elements cited in the sources is their use of the Kirby crackle. Can you describe that for us?
The Kirby crackle, a classic. It's a visual technique from the legendary comic artist Jack Kirby, used to signify pure, unbound cosmic energy. In the film, it's used specifically to create the illusion of kinetic energy around the super collider and when characters are exerting massive power. It's that visual cluster of black dots and white lines swirling and popping. It's just a genius piece of visual shorthand that instantly connects the film to decades of comic history.
This is where the conversation gets really technical and fascinating. The deliberate manipulation of movement itself. They called it stepped animation. They actually made the movement less smooth than a standard blockbuster.
That's the key technical risk they took. They deliberately avoided traditional motion blur, which makes movement look fluid and photographic. Instead, they used motion smearing or stepped animation. The standard for film is 24 images per second, animating on ones. Into the Spider-Verse often animated on twos, using only 12 distinct images per second, which creates that distinct, slightly jittery or crunchy look. It makes the animation feel handmade and stylized.
And this wasn't just a style choice, it was a character choice, which is just phenomenal storytelling.
It's the technical move that serves the narrative most effectively. They use the frame rate to underscore character development. For instance, Peter B. Parker, the experienced Spider-Man, he moves smoothly because he's animated on one's 24 frames per second. But Miles Morales, the inexperienced hero struggling with his powers, he moves awkwardly at 12 frames per second. That visual awkwardness literally communicates his lack of control.
And the sources noted they sometimes switched between those rates within the same shot. That sounds like a logistical nightmare for the animators.
An incredible challenge. It required a massive amount of planning. The animators had to manually decide when Miles achieved a moment of genuine control, maybe a quick burst of smooth movement, only to revert back to that jittery 12-feet look. This control over time created a visual dynamic that directly mirrored Miles's emotional arc. So when he finally takes that leap of faith at the climax, his movement snaps to a smooth 24 feet works.
And to enhance the comic book feel even further, they played with depth of field and color alignment.
They did. They used misaligned colors to create depth and mimic the imperfect nature of old printing. As if the cyan or magenta ink plates on a real press have been slightly off. It creates this subtle visual halo around objects, which actually aids the 3D effect. And that immersive nature led one reviewer to argue that this was one of the few films you needed to see in 3D, just because of how the hand-drawn elements worked with the format.
So we had this confluence of Japanese manga influence, classic American comics, and cutting-edge CGI. Which specific aesthetic influences did the sources point to?
The visual style was directly inspired by the art of Miles Morales' co-creator Sarah Pichelli and also Robbie Rodriguez. But they explicitly pulled from Japanese animation as well. They cited Hayao Miyazaki films and Katsuhiro Otomo's Akira as key inspirations for their sense of motion and detail. And P.G. Barker's anime-like design and their SPDR suit were specifically based on the aesthetic of Sailor Moon. It's a truly global mashup.
The critical reaction was just universally rapturous, absolute gorgeous, visually stunning, revolutionary. The words are all superlatives.
The sources are overwhelmingly positive. But we do have to address that one interesting note of self-correction we found. One reviewer mentioned the deliberate blurring of backgrounds in some shots, a technique called rack focus. It's usually used to focus your attention on the characters, but this reviewer was bothered by it, specifically because the background art was so rich and detailed, they wanted to see everything.
The classic complaint. The art is so good, don't hide it.
Exactly. It's a critique that is essentially just praising the art too highly. It suggests that maybe the deliberate visual flashiness was at times a bit overwhelming. But even with that minor note, the consensus holds. The style was so powerful and unique that it defined the film. The visuals weren't just window dressing. They were integrated into the core mechanism of the story and character.
That distinction, style as substance, is what elevates this film. Now let's move to the characters inhabiting this groundbreaking world. The ensemble cast, which maximized the potential of the multiverse concept.
Moving from the visual diversity to the character diversity, yeah. The multiverse mechanic let the filmmakers achieve another core goal, adapting actual comic figures who were as diverse as possible in ethnicity, age, gender, and power set.
And each new character brought a fundamentally different genre or animation style with them, which just reinforced the film's whole revolutionary aesthetic. Let's start with Gwen Stacy, or Spider-Gwen. She's a dimensionally displaced Spider-Woman who uses the alias Gwanda at Miles' school.
The sources confirmed a really crucial decision was made about her relationship with Miles, one that showed a lot of narrative maturity from the production team. They originally planned for a romance subplot between them, following some of the comic storylines, but that was deliberately scrapped during production.
Why the change of heart?
The filmmakers realized that inserting a romance would inevitably relegate Gwen to the role of a love interest. They wanted her to stand as a fully capable hero, defined by her own journey and her own skill. The sources emphasized that the priority was ensuring Gwen was defined by her competence and her own dimension's tragedy, losing her Peter Parker, not just as Miles' potential girlfriend.
And that choice to prioritize her own character development over a formulaic romance was a significant part of the film's praised maturity.
It was. And her visual style reflected her comic origins, too. Her animation used more pastel colors and flowing lines, especially when she was moving, which distinguished her visually from Miles' high-contrast world.
Next, let's talk about the absolute contrast to Gwen, the monochromatic character, Spider-Man Noir. He's from a 1930s universe, and the sources make a strong point about the brilliance of Nicolas Cage's voice work.
Oh, Cage, fully committed. He based his gravelly, hard-boiled performance on classic-era actors like Humphrey Bogart and the vocal mannerisms of stars like James Cagney and Edward G. Robinson. The sources really praised the dedication to the genre. His character only exists in shades of gray, which contrasts hysterically with the vibrant world around him.
And then there's Peanut Parker with her SPDR suit, who introduces that distinctive anime style.
Peony is a young Japanese-American girl who co-pilots a biomechanical suit with a radioactive spider that shares a telepathic link with her. The filmmakers actually chose her over other Asian-American Spider-Man candidates like Cindy Moon or Silk, and the reason was purely pragmatic. Peony's distinctive power set and her giant mecha suit just offered way more visual and animation possibilities within that genre-hopping structure.
And as you mentioned, her design was heavily inspired by Sailor Moon.
Heavily. That mix of genre noir, anime, classic cartoon, modern superhero is what made the team so rich. And rounding out the lineup, we have Peter B. Parker as the jaded mentor and the character that brought in the most purely slapstick comedy, Spider-Ham.
Or Peter Porker, a talking animal from an anthropomorphic, cartoon-like universe. His design was intentionally as cartoony as possible, right?
A walking Looney Tune, basically.
Hmm.
And this is where we found a specific conflict in the source viewpoints. While most reviewers universally praised the film's great humor and impressive comedy, one source we found thought Spider-Ham was just unfunny. They noted he was purely an excuse for another animation style to appear in the film.
It's a fair point. If you don't appreciate that specific meta, fourth wall breaking humor, he might feel a little jarring.
He might, but the wider consensus was that the overall wit of the script, like the humorous references to previous live-action Spider-Man scenes, like the infamous dance in Spider-Man 3, more than compensated for any specific character misfires.
Moving to the antagonists, the Kingpin, Wilson Fisk. We know his sympathetic backstory is key, his desire to resurrect his family, but the sources did note that his motivation felt not fully fleshed out.
Yeah, the focus was more on the mechanism of his grief rather than the methodology. But his physical design was immediately iconic. His look was gargantuan. His sheer width and bulk were described as asymptotically close to a parody, yet he still had this profound intensity. The designs for all the villains, Kingpin, Green Goblin, Prowler, were deliberately based on the Ultimate Marvel comic series designs, linking them visually to Miles' universe.
And then we have the fantastic reveal of Dr. Octopus as Olivia Octavius. The decision to gender flip the character came from director Bob Persichetti.
And this gender flip avoided some truly bizarre earlier concepts. Earlier drafts had considered a male Dr. Ock, who was a kind of the Big Lebowski-type character, a washed-out slacker scientist.
That would have been a choice.
A very different movie, making the character the hyper-competent, ruthless head scientist of Alchemax provided a much better dramatic foil for Miles and Peter B.
We can't talk about a Spider-Man film without addressing the cameos and references that honor its history. Stan Lee's appearance was noted as being incredibly significant.
It was vital. Stan Lee appears as a vendor who sells Miles his first proper costume. And the producers, Lord and Miller, stated it was absolutely necessary to give him a larger, extra meaningful moment beyond just a passing appearance. They said he was so integral to the spirit of this movie. The sources also confirmed there were multiple hidden Easter egg Stan Lee's sprinkled throughout the film, too.
And then the post-credits sequence that just blew everyone's mind and set up the massive scope of the sequels.
That sequence cemented the meta-narrative of the Spider-Verse. It features Oscar Isaac as Miguel O'Hara, Spider-Man 2099, arguing with the famously memeable Spider-Man from the 1967 animated series. That scene, which recreates the iconic pointing Spider-Man meme, generated massive immediate buzz and announced that this franchise was willing to embrace every corner of the character's history, no matter how absurd.
We also found some fascinating trivia from the production notes about ideas that were deemed too risky or confusing even for this movie.
Oh, yeah. The biggest scrapped idea involves the live-action actors. The script originally considered including Tobey Maguire, Andrew Garfield, and Tom Holland in a train station cameo. Tom Holland was just supposed to be a passerby who says, "Hey, kid," to Miles. But Sony ultimately canceled it, deeming it too confusing and risky for audiences at the time. They feared it would break the internal logic of the universe they were building.
That's a complex calculation, trying to gauge how much meta-narrative an audience can handle.
And they had to navigate other IP concerns. Miles' roommate, Genki Lee, originally had a much bigger role, but the character was simplified. Why? Because the similar character, Ned Leeds, was already featured so prominently as Peter Parker's best friend in the MCU's Homecoming. The filmmakers were concerned about audiences thinking they were ripping off the MCU.
And perhaps the funniest piece of deleted content. The home media release included an extended alt-universe cut with 30 minutes of cut footage, including a subplot where Miles learned to be Spider-Man not from Peter B. Parker, but from an audio commentary track featuring James Cameron and Tom Cruise discussing how to be an action star.
Can you even imagine? A disembodied voice track of two Hollywood heavyweights critiquing your crime-fighting technique. It just shows how wildly experimental and meta the ideas were even in the early stages. But ultimately, all these elements, the complex family story, the ambitious visuals, the diverse cast, the meta-references, created a true cultural phenomenon.
And that phenomenon translated directly into undeniable success and, more importantly, a lasting industry legacy.
The initial reception was just explosive. The film grossed $394 million worldwide against a budget of $90 million, so a definitive commercial success. Domestically, it actually surpassed Hotel Transylvania 2 to become Sony Pictures Animation's highest-grossing film, which signaled a major shift in what audiences were willing to pay for in animation.
But the critical consensus was even louder than the box office. It achieved universal acclaim, holding a staggering 97% approval rating on Rotten Tomatoes. The sources confirmed that, at the time, this made it the highest reviewed superhero film on the site.
And the praise was relentless. Reviewers called it the best standalone film to feature the iconic character so far, a thrilling, mind-bending joyride, and a film that somehow, through sheer creative gumption, does something new in the superhero genre.
The accolades confirmed its monumental status. Let's talk about the major award wins and the historical context of that Oscar win.
The film swept the major categories. It won Best Animated Feature at the 91st Academy Awards, the Golden Globes, the Critics' Choice Awards, and the BAFTAs. And that Oscar win was particularly significant because it was the first non-Disney or Pixar film to win Best Animated Feature since Rango back in 2011. In an industry just notoriously dominated by those two massive powerhouses, Into the Spider-Verse carved out a space for an entirely new kind of aesthetic excellence. It proved creative risk could be rewarded at the highest level.
The industry response was immediate. Director Rian Johnson famously coined the term that has stuck to this film. He called it the velvet underground of superhero movies.
And that analogy is just perfect, because the Velvet Underground, they weren't commercially massive in their time, but they inspired every musician who heard them to start a band. Johnson predicted that Spider-Verse would sell moderately well, but would be profoundly influential on every subsequent filmmaker who saw it. And he was absolutely right. The film gave others permission to break the rules.
That influence spread instantly across the industry, even to rival studios. Marvel Studios president Kevin Feige loved it, and the MCU's own Spider-Man, Tom Holland, called it the best Spider-Man movie that's ever been made.
I mean, that's a massive endorsement from the actor currently playing the live-action role.
It is.
And even international animation giants acknowledged its significance. Yoshiyuki Tomino, the legendary creator of Gundam, he commented on the film's high technical level and experimental nature after its Oscar win. He noted that for American filmgoers, Spider-Verse might be the first time they were genuinely watching animation that wasn't explicitly marketed to kids. And crucially, he encouraged the entire Japanese anime industry to recognize this boundary-pushing quality and strive to surpass it.
So even Pixar, the perennial industry leader, recognized the challenge.
They did. Pixar co-director Kemp Powers, who later directed the Spider-Verse sequel, he recalled watching an early cut with Pixar staff. He said that even that notoriously tough, highly technical crowd was blown away and agreed that the movie would revolutionize the medium.
So let's get down to the tangible legacy, defining a new aesthetic. This film created a permission structure for visual experimentation that fundamentally changed the look of other major studio animation.
It absolutely did. The unique blend of 2D ink lines, stepped animation, and graphic effects from Into the Spider-Verse was subsequently reused and influenced numerous major films and series. The influence is most clear in other films from Lord and Miller, like Sony's next big hit, The Mitchells vs. the Machines, which leaned heavily into that chaotic, graphic, visually noisy aesthetic.
But the influence wasn't just confined to the Sony ecosystem, which proves the aesthetic shift was industry-wide.
No, we saw DreamWorks Animation pivot significantly. Their films, The Bad Guys, and maybe most strikingly, Puss in Boots. The Last Wish clearly drew inspiration from the Spider-Verse aesthetic. Specifically, Puss in Boots adopted the principles of stepped animation, using 12 frames per second for some action, and it incorporated hand-drawn impact lines and a more graphic, painterly background texture. It was a sharp departure from DreamWorks' usual polished photorealism.
It even crossed the boundary into live-action production, influencing how visual effects are approached.
That's perhaps the most surprising example. The directors of the live-action MCU series, Mrs. Marvel, explicitly said they wanted the show to be Into the Spider-Verse in live action. And this led directly to the unique visual effects in that series, with stylized text, comic book panel framing, and dynamic hand-drawn effects integrated into the live-action environment.
And ultimately, the success of Into the Spider-Verse proved a massive commercial point. That risk was viable.
Yes, films like Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, Mutant Mayhem were cited as proving that a movie can deliberately look like raw concept artwork and still be a huge commercial and critical success. Into the Spider-Verse shattered the expectation that mainstream animated blockbusters have to adhere to that high-polish, hyper-smooth, photorealistic style. It proved that stylized graphic art could carry a major franchise.
Which naturally leads us to the expansion of that very franchise.
Given the universal acclaim and the strong box office, that incredible buzz immediately led Sony to treat this as the foundation of a new, massive franchise.
That's right. The story proved too large for a single feature film, so it was quickly put into development for sequels. The main narrative was split into two films.
The first sequel, Across the Spider-Verse, came out in 2023 to similar critical acclaim. Maintaining the highest of standards and achieved even greater commercial success. It surpassed the original's box office take in a staggering 12 days. And the sources confirmed the third part of the story, Beyond the Spider-Verse, is scheduled for 2027.
Beyond the main trilogy, Sony immediately started looking at spin-offs to capitalize on the rich, diverse cast of dimension hoppers they had created.
A major spin-off film focusing on female spider-related characters was announced soon after the first film's release. This project, often dubbed the Spider-Women film, focuses on three generations of heroes: Spider-Gwen, Jessica Drew Spider-Woman, and Cindy Moonsilk. The sources indicate that this project is still in active development, with Haley Steinfeld, the voice of Gwen, expressing continued public interest.
We also had a very fun, if highly ambitious, pitch for another potential spin-off that came directly from the cast.
John Mulaney, the voice of Spider-Ham, he pitched a separate spin-off centered on his character. He suggested the plot should be a Watergate-like story, focusing on Spider-Ham's career as a hard-hitting investigative reporter for the Daily Bugle, explicitly comparing the concept to classic journalism films like The Post or All the President's Men.
A hard-boiled investigative journalism cartoon pig in a trench coat chasing down corrupt politicians. That idea is pure gold, even if it might only exist in the realm of hyper-meta parody.
And finally, the creative architects of this universe, Lord and Miller, they extended their reach significantly into television, ensuring that the Spider-Verse ecosystem could spread across multiple platforms.
They signed a massive 5-year deal with Sony Pictures Television to create animated Marvel series. What does this mean for the future structure of this universe?
It means the Spider-Verse is more than just a trilogy. Chris Miller confirmed they were working on several unique series, some animated, some potentially live action, that would all be related to each other, creating this coherent, interconnected web of content under their guidance. Similar to what Marvel Studios has done, but with an emphasis on unique visual styles rather than cinematic consistency, the web is clearly still expanding.
So, looking back at this whole stack of sources we've synthesized, this deep dive really reveals that Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse succeeded because it flawlessly executed this perfect, creative tightrope walk. They managed to balance a core, relatable, emotional character, Miles' journey of self-acceptance and his family struggles, with an absolutely innovative visual style that was somehow both nerdy and inviting. The animation wasn't just decoration, it was, quite literally, integral to the story of a hero finding his unique rhythm.
The legacy is absolute and undeniable. This movie took monumental creative risks, commissioning the largest animation crew Sony had ever used, embracing a complicated new technical pipeline, integrating archaic printing techniques, and fundamentally rejecting the dominant, smooth, photorealistic animation style of the day. And because of those calculated, audacious risks, it's universally recognized as a genuine paradigm-shifting game changer that provided an industry roadmap for stylized graphic success.
It's the film that taught Hollywood that comic book movies don't have to look like movies. They can and should look like comic books. And we've detailed how this film used specific, almost obsolete comic book and motion techniques like Ben-Day dots and stepped animation to push the animated medium into a new future.
Which raises an important, provocative question for you, the listener, to consider as you reflect on this dive. If the future of animation, as proven by Spider-Verse, lies in perfecting the aesthetic look of its own past, what other obsolete or highly stylized traditional media formats like 8-bit pixel art, the specific constraints of black and white silent film aesthetics, or even the look of stop-motion shadow puppetry might be the next wave to revolutionize modern blockbuster filmmaking?
The answer might be hiding in the history we thought we left behind.
The well of aesthetic risk is deeper than we think.
That is a truly fascinating thought to web swing away with. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.